The Chinese market is arguably the biggest in the world. There's no place in the world where their system, industry, and malls are not found. Now, their latest target is Latin America, precisely Mexico. What are their market principles? How are they inflating the economic systems of Mexico? And what does the US think about this subtle but definite takeover? This video will answer these questions and many more. Watch this video to the end, as you'll be shocked by how much hold China has on the market system and industries of Mexico, and by extension, Latin America. But before we begin, thank you for choosing to watch another one of our amazing videos. To enjoy more of these videos, subscribe to Economics Reasons and click the notification bell to get a front row seat. Let's begin. For years, foreign policy experts claimed that the Chinese Communist Party had no interest in Latin America. The conventional wisdom was that the Chinese regime didn't want to be a global hegemon and just wanted its own little sphere of influence over Taiwan, the South China Sea, all of Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Coast, Antarctica, and Africa. Once again, the conventional wisdom was totally wrong about China. Over the last 20 years, the Chinese Communist Party has gained a lot of influence in Latin America, and Latin America is still looking east with open arms. How did China become so influential? With the same playbook it has been using around the world. Firstly, by getting its foot inside the door with trade. China has become the top trading partner for many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and is the second biggest behind the US for the region as a whole. Latin America's trade with China went from $18 billion in 2002 to $450 billion in 2021, which is an enormous jump. Latin America exports raw materials like soybeans, copper, and oil to China, while China sends finished manufactured goods to Latin America, often undercutting local manufacturers with cheaper prices. For example, in Mexico, this has destroyed local shoe, textile, and toy industries. Cheap Chinese imports are basically keeping Latin America from building wealth through manufacturing. But while trade opens the doors to Chinese influence, what really cements it is the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative. Earlier this year, Argentina joined the Belt and Road, which means that now 21 out of the 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are in it. On the surface, that means a lot of infrastructure investment, which is what these Latin American countries want, such as building roads, ports, mines, rails, and 5G, things that these countries can't afford on their own. China is expanding its influence in Latin America and is also investing in infrastructure projects like a mega port in Peru. But China's infrastructure investments also pave the way for a huge amount of resource extraction, as Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile have over half of the world's lithium, a key component for batteries. And China has made billions of dollars of investments in Latin American lithium. And not just lithium, as not even Latin American seafood is safe. China's resource extraction is bringing a lot of problems with it, as Chinese companies are having a devastating environmental impact in Latin America. They don't care about following environmental and labor regulations, and they definitely don't care about human rights, as they've gotten into trouble for, quote, repressing miners in Peru, forcibly displacing indigenous families in Ecuador, and polluting groundwater, rivers, and glaciers in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Locals aren't too happy about what these companies are doing either, and have protested in Peru over a Chinese copper mine. But this is all still incredibly lucrative for the Chinese Communist Party, and it's not just about economic gain, but also about political influence as well, specifically about Taiwan. China dangles economic promises in return for cutting diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and it's working wonders for Beijing. Last year, Nicaragua cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan after years of being wooed by China, and only 14 countries now recognize Taiwan, as 8 of them are in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it makes sense that part of China's political focus on Latin America is about shutting Taiwan out from the international community, while the other part is about challenging the US. China is increasingly cooperative with Latin America, and it's offering more than just trade, as it offers security agreements too, and gifts like anti-riot equipment and police vehicles. However, the best gift of all is surveillance technology, which is easily abused. For example, Ecuador's cutting-edge surveillance system was completely designed and built by Chinese companies, including Huawei. And the surveillance footage didn't just go to the police, but it also went to a domestic intelligence agency under its previous leader that persecuted his political opponents, and is one way China is promoting authoritarianism through technology. The Chinese Communist Party also supports regimes like Cuba and Venezuela with digital authoritarianism by helping them censor the internet. Chinese company ZTE also helped Venezuela create a digital ID card that can be used for social control. China's supporting countries like Cuba and Venezuela also challenged the US, and the US government sees China's increasing influence in Latin America as a security threat. According to US Admiral Craig Fowler, former head of US Southern Command, China is seeking economic dominance over Latin America, and he says China is also seeking to establish global logistics and basing infrastructure in our hemisphere in order to project and sustain military power at greater distances. They're not quite there yet, as there's no permanent Chinese military base in Latin America, but that doesn't mean they're not looking for one. Earlier this month, the US hosted the Summit of the Americas, a meeting for all the nations of North, Central, and South America to come together and discuss the most important issues facing the Western Hemisphere. But the US had other plans, most notably the desire to counter Beijing's rising influence in the region. In 2021, Chinese and Latin American trade exceeded $400 billion, compared to just $295 billion for the US. But before this year's summit began, a massive controversy unfolded as the US decided to ban Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua from attending the summit, simply because the US doesn't feel those countries share the same values in a democracy. This decision, made by the US government, was embarrassing and selfish, and it immediately backfired in their face. When the US held a diplomatic boycott against the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, the Latin Americans used this same action against the US. The most outspoken critic was Mexican President Obrador, who turned down the chance to meet Joe Biden in Los Angeles over the decision to ban these three countries from participating. Leaders from Honduras, Bolivia, El Salvador, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines all followed Mexico's lead, and instead of hosting a summit whose stated goal was to build a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. The only thing this summit will be remembered for is the countries who weren't allowed to come, and more so those countries who sent a clear message to the US that they don't agree with playing political games at important world summits. One of the most common errors the US government makes in foreign diplomacy is that they always want the world to do things their way, and they selfishly think that whatever is good for America must be good for the whole world. However, every country deserves the right to choose its own form of government and have the freedom to choose whom they do business with. In an article from the South China Morning Post, Just China's Vision, China is seemingly everywhere, investing in strategic technologies, embedding itself in 5G networks and other infrastructure, building military alliances, working political relationships, and joining projects early to gain influence. Of the 31 countries in this region, 25 of them have partnered with China to build much-needed infrastructure projects for economic development. The Summit of the Americas was supposed to be the US's chance to show its commitment to the Latin American region, but unfortunately for the US, the summit was poorly organized and lacked any real tangible benefits for the nations who attended. The president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard House, stated that the Summit of the Americas looked to be a debacle, a diplomatic goal, and that the US had no trade proposal, no immigration policy, and no infrastructure package. Instead, the focus is on who will and who will not be there, and it's unclear why they press for it to happen. Nicholas Cole, professor of public diplomacy at the University of Southern California, stated that it's freaking amateur hour, and it doesn't seem like the US is prepared with an image in mind, and that Chinese summits are a different animal. In an article by the South China Morning Post, the authors highlight the difference between the US and the Chinese summits. The US hosts their summits to make sure that every country that attends respects and embraces America's vision of democracy. This is ultimately an unrealistic goal, as it's impossible for every country to embrace the American style of governance, while, in contrast, China comes to the table handing out infrastructure projects that Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America all desperately need to advance their economies. Another problem for the US government is the lack of money they have to offer at these summits. The US government always prioritizes projects that back the military-industrial complex, with the best example being the Biden administration proposing to send $40 billion to Ukraine for more military supplies. The big winner of this deal, of course, is America's defense contractors. Meanwhile, at the Summit of the Americas, Biden offered $617 million for the 31 countries in Latin America, which is just under $20 million per country. Joe Biden also offered $150 million for the 10 countries in the Asian alliance, compared to China's $1.5 billion pledge last November to the same region. Political science professors at National Taiwan University went on to state that Biden's main problem is this administration's inability to offer economic goodies to foreign countries in exchange for them to happily align with the US, because global liberalism has been so successfully discredited by Trump and detested by the American voters. China, on the other hand, has more leverage and ultimately comes down to a difference in how China operates politically. In the West, economics is important, but as seen in Los Angeles, they are often overshadowed by other issues, including migration, women's rights, inequality, and governance. In China, dissent is not part of the process, as everyone knows what is expected. A direct quote from Jeffrey Moon, a former U.S. Consul General in Chengdu. In America, such events have economic dimensions, but the political dimension is much more important. The world knows China is a one-party system and will continue to be for the foreseeable future, with President Xi Jinping set to rule indefinitely. The U.S. is a two-party state, and the Democrats are expected to lose a lot of power in the upcoming midterm elections. Will the U.S. elect a Republican president in 2024? As all of these factors are important for Latin American countries to consider. When Joe Biden took office, there was a lot of optimism in Latin America, as when he was vice president, he visited the region 16 times, and unfortunately, there was too much talking and not enough action. At the 2009 Summit of the Americas, Joe Biden's message to Latin America was, "We genuinely want to be collaborative. We genuinely want to engage." Noticing how he discusses things with, quote, wanting to do this and not, quote, we are going to do this. Eric Farnsworth, a former State Department official, recently shared that the Latin America region is crying out for economic relief following the pandemic and is getting little to no help from the US. Meanwhile, China is sitting and waiting with an open checkbook. Farnsworth went on to state that we, the US, have got to become more proactive, and we need to start offering things that the hemisphere finds attractive. Moving forward, the US and China will continue to battle for more leverage in regions all across the world. The hope, especially for smaller developing nations, is to have the chance to collaborate and partner with both the US and China, firmly standing by the words of the Barbadian Prime Minister that we need to do more talking with than talking at. Well, we've come to the end of today's video. Do let us know what you think of China's massive takeover of the market of Mexico and other Latin American countries in the comments section down below. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to this channel for more amazing videos in the future. But until then, we'll see you in the next video. Take care.